The wind cut through Hadley, Massachusetts that winter of 1824 like a blade, carrying whispers of something no man dared name. 17 families vanished over 3 months. Not stolen, not slaughtered, not even coerced, but gone. Their homes remained, hearths cold, meals untouched, their lives abandoned as though compelled by a force no science could define. And always, hovering in the shadows of their disappearance, one name surfaced: Ezekiel Drummond. At first, he was a man of learning, a Harvard scholar, fluent in every language that mattered to a gentleman of influence, but behind his silver-grey eyes and measured voice, a darkness thrived, a darkness that would soon bend the human mind to a will it could not resist. His methods were meticulous, almost surgical. Journals filled with the inner thoughts of his students became instruments of subtle domination. Conversations that seemed casual were traps of insight, drawing secrets out of hearts too trusting to resist. And yet, the authorities, naive, unprepared, could only report the obvious. The people were gone. What they never realized, what they buried in dusty ledgers and whispered denials, was that Hadley had become an experimental chamber, and the experiment was far from over. Drummond arrived in Hadley with the precision of a predator entering a new territory. A tall man, silver hair framing a face that seemed carved from intellect itself, he carried a presence that demanded attention, but it was more than presence. It was command. Parents found themselves confessing worries they had never spoken aloud. Sons revealed thoughts they had never dared consider. He did not teach as others did. He probed. He observed. Every glance, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion in the students' journals became data, an anatomy of desire, fear, and obedience. Evening after evening, Drummond walked the streets, black coat brush hing the snow, journal in hand, pausing outside homes of Hadley's most prominent families, not merely watching, but mapping, the way a general surveys a battlefield before deploying forces. Families felt the gaze without understanding it, a weight pressing into their private lives. And yet it was not fear alone that drew them. It was fascination. Even the skeptical could not resist the lure of his intellect. By winter's end, whispers of Drummond's insight had spread through the valley. But curiosity, once sparked, is a dangerous flame. And Hadley was about to discover just how easily a man could turn knowledge into a cage. January 14th, 1824. The Chamberlains, one of Hadley's most respected families, went to bed as they always had, normal, orderly, confident in the safety of their hearth. Samuel, the shrewd grain merchant, had counted coins, balanced contracts, and readied plans for the spring. Mercy, diligent and revered, had tended to the sick and organized the charitable society's efforts. Their children, Benjamin, Sarah, and little Thomas, had studied, practiced, played, and laughed without a hint of knowing the horror that awaited. And yet, the next morning, they were gone. Mrs. Abigail Hartwell, their neighbor, discovered the truth. No smoke rose from the chimney in the bitter cold. Inside, the house stood frozen in time. The porridge had solidified in its bowls. Tea had iced in the cups. Schoolbooks lay open, quills poised mid-sentence, toys arranged in precise games. And the fifth-place setting at the breakfast table, that silent, inexplicable invitation, suggested a presence unseen. Their heavy winter clothing, essential for survival in sub-zero temperatures, hung neatly by the door. Someone, or something, had orchestrated a departure that defied nature, logic, and reason. Footprints led into the forest, bare feet perfectly aligned, traversing drifts higher than a man's knee. No struggle, no theft, only a chilling inevitability. The Chamberlains walked into the abyss because someone had taught them to see the void and to desire it. The Chamberlains were not the first to vanish, and they would not be the last. Drummond's genius lay in invisibility, the kind that sinks into the mind before the body follows. He understood the mechanics of human will, the hidden levers of obedience no one else could see. Journals were not merely academic exercises. They were instruments of control, revealing fear, desire, and doubt. Conversations, casual in appearance, were drills of influence, layering suggestion over thought until the line between choice and compulsion blurred. Families did not flee Hadley, they walked willingly, drawn by a current they could not resist, their minds already reshaped before their feet hit the snow. He studied them like one studies a chessboard, mapping weaknesses, predicting responses, orchestrating compliance. Every interaction, the nod, the question, the subtle praise, was a calculated move. The townspeople had no frame to understand what had taken hold. It was not mere persuasion, not even hypnotism in its crude sense. It was deeper, a surgical dismantling of identity, a psychological architecture that reshaped their very perception of reality. By the time the constables arrived, it was too late. Drummond's influence had already passed through the bloodlines, threading through hearts and minds. And in Hadley, a town that had prided itself on morality and intellect, the first seeds of a controlled exodus had taken root. As winter deepened, Hadley's other families began to sense a subtle shift, a weight in the air they could not name. Conversations felt heavier, thoughts lingered longer than they should. A presence, unseen yet palpable, threaded through the town like a cold wind, touching every hearth, every mind. Drummond's nightly walks were more than observation. They were calibration. Each pause at a window, each note in his journal, tuned him to the vulnerabilities of the house Hambibas, old inside. No one spoke openly of the Chamberlain's disappearance. Fear whispered its warning, but fascination whispered louder. How could a man bend the will of even the most prudent? Parents found themselves reconsidering decisions. Children hesitated over minor choices as if someone else was standing behind them. And slowly, imperceptibly, they began to mirror the obedience Drummond had studied and nurtured in his students. By February, entire homes followed patterns he had traced. Early lights extinguished, doors left slightly ajar, bare footprints in snow that did not match any known schedule. The town's prosperity, its orderly routines, became a stage for his experiment. And yet, no one knew the endgame. Every thoughtful citizen, every protective parent, every diligent child was now caught in a network of unseen influence. And Hadley, a town built on trust and tradition, was slipping quietly into Drummond's design. Drummond's power was not in coercion, but in subtle reconstruction of the human mind. He did not need chains. He crafted invisible prisons within thoughts. Journals became mirrors reflecting fears and desires the owners had never consciously acknowledged. In private conferences, he dissected these reflections with surgical precision, revealing weaknesses that felt like self-realizations. By framing suggestion as insight, he made compliance appear as choice. Parents doubted their instincts, children questioned their impulses, and all began to defer silently to an unseen authority. His observations were relentless, almost predatory. Nothing escaped him. The tremor of a hand, a hesitation in speech, the brief glance toward the window. Every behavior, every subtle reaction was catalogued and exploited. By the time a family sensed the manipulation, it was too late. The architecture of their decision-making had already been redrawn. And yet, Drummond did not rush. Patience was his ally. Weeks, even months passed, as he wove the threads of influence into an unbreakable tapestry. He understood that real control is quiet, invisible, and irresistible. Those who thought themselves autonomous were, in fact, instruments performing a symphony they did not realize was orchestrated. By midwinter, Hadley's proud families were no longer just residents. They were components of an experiment that blurred the boundary between obedience and annihilation. January turned to February, and the first mass disappearance unfolded with the precision of a ritual. Houses stood frozen in time, meals untouched, fires cold, and yet the families were gone. Bare footprints led in straight lines into the forest, unbroken by hesitation, slipping into the white abyss as though guided by invisible hands. Drummond had orchestrated not chaos, but a deliberate migration of the human will. Each vanished family After silent message, compliance is inevitability. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of the strange fifth-place setting at breakfast tables, of journals left open mid-thought, of toys meticulously arranged in games no one played. No valuables were stolen, no struggle disturbed the order. They had abandoned life itself willingly, as if drawn by some magnetic pull implanted by a mind more cunning than their own. Constables, scholars, even ministers were baffled. How could entire households walk into sub-zero snow without protection and survive, or even choose to leave at all? The answer was hidden in plain sight, locked inside the precise manipulations of one man. Drummond had not forced them, he had invited them to step beyond themselves. And as the town watched their neighbors vanish like phantoms, an unspoken dread began to take root. In Hadley, resistance was a concept, not a possibility. Fear in Hadley was no longer whispered. It had become a living presence, stretching its long fingers through every home. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion, their eyes flicking to windows, to empty streets, to the footprints that led nowhere. Yet alongside fear grew a dangerous fascination. Drummond had taught them, without a single overt command, to obey a force they could not name. Parents questioned their own judgment. Scholars second-guessed insight. Children hesitated in ways that suggested someone else guided their choices. His nightly walks became legend. Black coat, journal in hand, he moved like a conductor over a symphony only he could hear. Each pause, each note taken, refined his orchestration, until the community itself had become an instrument tuned to his subtle manipulations. No one dared confront him directly, and even those who wanted to resist felt their wills dissolve in his presence, as if logic and reason were suspended in the cold air he breathed into Hadley. By midwinter, the town teetered on the edge of surrender, its citizens walking a fine line between awe and terror. The invisible web had grown taut, ensnaring hearts and minds alike, and one truth became undeniable. Those who believed themselves free were already prisoners. Drummond's genius lay in patterns hidden in plain sight. Every meal, every journal entry, every evening observation formed a code only he could read and only he could use. Families unconsciously mimicked routines he had designed, unknowingly rehearsing obedience. Children arranged toys in sequences that reflected his teachings. Parents followed rituals that mirrored his unseen instructions. Even the town's public gatherings, from church to market, fell into rhythms he had subtly influenced. And then, like a key unlocking a door, Drummond introduced the final layer, the symbolic. A gesture, a phrase, a position. At the table, small enough to seem trivial, but powerful enough to bend the will. He had discovered the ancient truth the elites had long known. Identity can be rewritten with symbols, repeated until they override instinct. And now, Hadley's citizens were walking symbols themselves, enacting a drama scripted by a single mind. Pause for a moment. In your own life, consider this. If influence can work silently, invisibly, could it already be shaping you? Comment below the phrase, "I see the unseen," twice. Let it lock in your awareness, mark your mind as attuned, and step further into truths too dangerous for most to face. The descent is no longer theoretical. It begins with recognition. By mid-February, Hadley had become a town of shadows. Families were no longer simply observed, they were anticipated. Drummond's subtle orchestration had reached its apex. The people themselves moved toward the void he had designed, guided by impulses they believed their own. Parents led children through icy streets, leaving doors unlocked, fires unlit, possessions untouched. Each step into the snow was both surrender and affirmation, a conscious act of obedience disguised as instinct. And for those who hesitated, small reminders appeared. A journal note left unread, a casual comment that struck a nerve, the weight of Drummond's gaze, even unseen, imagined, internalized. Survival itself had become subordinate to the invisible architecture of influence. Rumors spread, whispered in the warmth of the few homes left behind. Some returned, trembling, speaking of a compulsion they could not resist, their minds fractured by the experience. Trauma, though unrecorded, etched itself into every survivor's memory. The vanished families had not simply fled, they had been transformed. Drummond's experiment was not about death or theft. It was about mastery over choice, over identity, over the prize. Male instinct to protect one's own. And as the last snowdrifts of February settled over Hadley, it became painfully clear. The line between free will and control had been erased. The authorities eventually gained entry to Drummond's private study, a place no one had seen, no one had dared question. Bookshelves lined the walls, dense with texts on philosophy, psychology, and rhetoric. But it was the margins, the annotations, and the hidden journals that revealed the truth. There were charts, intricate diagrams mapping human emotion, obedience, and influence with a precision that bordered on madness. Small artifacts collected from Hadley's families, locks of hair, personal trinkets, sketches of rooms and hearths, sat carefully catalogued, each linked to a psychological profile. It was not theft, it was a laboratory. Notes described each family's daily routines, their fears, even the smallest gestures, cross-referenced with strategies to subtly bend their behavior. Some pages were written in cipher, referencing ancient techniques of control used by secret societies and elite manipulators, knowledge centuries old, thought lost or forbidden. And there, on a desk, lay the final plan. A precise timetable for the exodus of 17 families, their compliance engineered down to the last heartbeat. Officials, unprepared for such calculated cruelty, chose silence. Public records were sanitized, reports dismissed as hysteria or unexplained departures. The truth, too powerful to face, was buried, but the echoes remained, footprints in snow, frozen meals, and the whisper of one name that would haunt Hadley forever, Ezekiel Drummond. The aftermath of Drummond's work was silent, insidious, and absolute. Hadley remained, but it was no longer the town it had been. Families that remained were cautious, mistrustful, their routines rigid, their minds quietly fractured. Children grew up knowing a fear they could not name, learning obedience as instinct. Whispers of the vanished families became cautionary tales, yet no one could explain why they had left, or why some returned, hollow-eyed, carrying memories that shattered the mind. The academy thrived outwardly, but behind its doors, the methodology Drummond had perfected lingered like a ghost, shaping a generation without their knowledge. Those who tried to reconstruct the events found only fragments, frozen meals, journals filled with confessions, footprints leading nowhere. The missing families became myth, their disappearance rationalized as madness or divine intervention. But the psychological architecture remained, a hidden grid threading through Hadley's society, threading through the descendants of those who stayed. Drummond's genius was subtle. He did not destroy the town. He transformed it into a living experiment of obedience, surveillance, and internalized control. And in every heartbeat, every glance, every choice the survivors made, his influence whispered, "Free will is an illusion." To understand Hadley was to confront a terrifying truth. Humans can be guided, reshaped, and vanished, and never even realize it. What happened in Hadley was not an isolated event. Drummond's techniques echoed practices long whispered in forbidden texts, in elite circles, in the hidden corridors of power. He tapped into knowledge of psychological architecture that governments, secret societies, and scholars had pursued for centuries. The art of reshaping perception, bending will, erasing resistance. The seemingly inexplicable disappearances were a microcosm of influence on a global scale, a laboratory for understanding the mechanics of obedience. Every footstep into the forest, every frozen meal, every willingly abandoned hearth was a demonstration of principles designed to control not by force, but by design. And the lesson was chillingly simple. Power is not held by those who wield weapons, but by those who can bend thought. Drummond had weaponized insight, turning curiosity, fear, and trust into a system of compliance. The families of Hadley were the first victims, but history is full of unseen experiments, disguised as education, governance, or mentorship. By tracing Drummond's methods, one can see a pattern repeating over centuries, societies shaped not by overt coercion, but by invisible architectures of control. Knowledge, it seemed, could be far more dangerous than ignorance. Even decades later, Hadley carried the weight of that winter like a shadow. The snow that had swallowed footprints, frozen meals, and vanished families became a metaphor for the invisible chains Drummond had forged. Streets, homes, and fields seemed ordinary to outsiders, but those who knew the history understood. Something fundamental had shifted. Survivors spoke in fragments, memories fragmented into whispers of compulsion, of walking without understanding why, of surrendering their will to a force they never saw. The academy, still thriving, was both a monument to his brilliance and a warning. The methods he employed had seeped into the foundation of education itself, and everywhere subtle patterns endured. The repetition of gestures, the hidden symbols, the uncanny sense of guidance, as if invisible eyes followed each action, shaping choice without notice. Drummond had proved a terrifying truth. Humanity can be persuaded to walk into the void, to abandon life itself, if the architecture of control is precise enough. And the echo of Hadley's frozen winter lives on, a testament to the power of intellect unrestrained by morality, and a reminder that the mind can be mastered long before the body ever follows. The most horrifying aspect of Hadley's winter was not the vanished families. It was what they became in their absence. By the time Drummond's influence reached its apex, they were no longer simply victims. Minds reshaped, identities rewritten. They acted as instruments of a design they could not resist, moving with a precision that was terrifyingly unnatural. They obeyed without question, guided by impulses they believed were their own, leaving homes, possessions, and lives behind, as if compelled by an unseen hand. And yet, this obedience was seductive. There was a strange clarity in surrender, a dangerous peace in following the invisible architecture of control. Some who survived described it as a trance, others as revelation. But all recognized the same truth. Their sense of self had been dismantled brick by brick and rebuilt according to another's blueprint. Drummond did not merely erase. He instructed, curated, perfected, and the lesson extended far beyond Hadley. Influence, when applied with insight and patience, can transform willing human beings into instruments of design, capable of walking into danger, into absence, without hesitation. That is the legacy he left, a map of compliance, a masterclass in psychological domination, and a warning hidden in plain sight. Hadley remains a ghost town of memory. Though the houses still stand, the streets still wind through the valley, and the snow melts and returns each year. But the invisible architecture Drummond built endures in every mind attuned to obedience, in every hidden lever of influence waiting to be pulled. He proved that power does not reside in force, wealth, or authority. It resides in the ability to shape perception, to bend choice, to rewrite identity without leaving a mark. The families who walked into the wilderness that winter were not lost. They were transformed, instruments of an intellect so precise it was indistinguishable from inevitability. And now, after centuries, the lesson remains. The human mind can be mastered long before the body is ever compelled. Remember, what you perceive as freedom may already be scripted, your choices prearranged by forces unseen. Those who grasp this knowledge awaken, those who ignore it remain prey. Comment the phrase, "I see the unseen," twice. Let it anchor you. Let it mark your awareness, because understanding is the first step toward mastery, and ignorance is the first step toward disappearance. Ezekiel Drummond's Hadley was not merely a town. It was a warning. And now you have seen the warning.